Good afternoon. Welcome to the second session on the end of the Second World War and the start of the Cold War in Europe. I'm Alistair Young. I'm a professor in the Samnan School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech, and I hold the Neo Family Chair. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Nunn School. There are its two constituent centers, the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy, and the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies. Are joined by the Atlantic Council on International Relations, and this event is supported by the Colonel Leslie Callahan Memorial Fund. Today I'm delighted to be joined by four of my colleagues, or recent colleagues. The first will be looking at the immediate post-war period, following on from yesterday's session about how the war ended. The first presentation will be by Dr. Claire Greenstein of the University of Alabama and Dr. Vicky Birchfield, a colleague in the Nunn School who's currently based at Georgia Tech's campus in Metz, France, talking about Europe in chaos immediately after the war. Claire will focus on Eastern Europe, Vicky on Western Europe. A slight change to the program, they will be followed by General Philip Breedlove, former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, who'll be talking about the military disposition at the end of the war. And then Dr. Katja Weber, my colleague in the Nunn School, will be taking over to talk about the new political and institutional geography in Europe in the immediate post-war period. I'm very grateful to Chris McDermott, who's set this up and is running the technology. He will be fielding questions, so we ask if you have any questions to please enter them in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom on the right-hand side of your screen, and Chris will be feeding questions to us at the end. General Breedlove has a hard stop at noon, and so he'll have to be stepping off, but Woody Woodson has agreed to try and field, Woody Woodcock has agreed to field his questions related to his topic. So if I can turn it over to Claire and Vicky.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alistair. Chris, could you pull my PowerPoint up, please? Thank you. All right. So I am thrilled to be here today. Thank you so much for coming. I'm going to be talking about Eastern Europe at the end of World War II. Next slide, please. Fabulous. Okay, so bottom line is Eastern Europe at the end of World War II was devastated. Not only do we have extreme loss of life, but cities were also leveled. I'm going to highlight here, you can see that the overall population for many of these countries, they lost between 10 and 25% of their pre-war populations. And of course, the Jewish population was hit particularly hard, with Lithuania, Poland, and Yugoslavia losing almost 90% of their pre-war Jewish population. Cities as well, the housing stock was decimated in particular. And so this is a context where people don't have enough shelter, they don't have enough food, they don't have enough clean water, they don't have enough clothes, and really people are just looking for some sort of stability and trying to survive. Next slide, please. Thank you. So understandably, in this context where people were just fighting to make it through to the next day, the violence continued as well. Just because a peace treaty had been signed and the war was technically over did not mean that people were able to flick off the switch that had that they turned on during the war, where you have to fight for survival. People had experienced 5 to 6 years of anti-Jewish propaganda, of being told that Jews were the enemy, that they had to be killed, where they had been rewarded for murdering their Jewish neighbors. And so this anti-Jewish violence in particular was prevalent across the region. Holocaust survivors who returned home, many of them had asked neighbors, would you look after our family heirlooms? Would you take care of the family farm? And they showed up and they went to the neighbor and said, hello, here I am. Can I have my things back? And the neighbors would say things like, well, I thought they killed all of you. Why are you here? They should have gotten you too. You're lying. You never gave us anything. This is my property. And if you stick around, then I'm going to call the police on you. So extremely rude receptions, and most of these traumatized Holocaust survivors were not going to press the issue. They abandoned their property, and many of them emigrated. Once they realized they were no longer welcome and at home, they left permanently. And then more dramatically, there were pogroms, anti-Jewish violence across the region as well. A famous example here is the Kielce pogrom that occurred in Poland in 1946, where there was a dormitory in the town of Jewish Polish Holocaust survivors. And members of the ethnic Polish population of the town started a rumor that the Holocaust survivors had kidnapped an ethnic Polish child, locked it in the basement, and were going to murder it. This was completely untrue. Everybody knew it was untrue, but it gave the ethnic Poles an excuse to start a riot and to murder members of the Jewish community, which is what these ethnic Poles had wanted to do in the first place. So it gave sort of a moral legitimacy, a cover for the violence. And so 40 Holocaust survivors were murdered during this particular pogrom. And you can see at the top right, there is the funeral procession after the pogrom. But the pogrom was not an isolated event. These pogroms occurred around Eastern Europe. And oftentimes the police would participate. The local, in Poland, the Catholic Church usually did not condemn episodes of violence like this. There were instances where children would participate as well in the anti-Jewish violence. There were also instances where people on trains, Jewish individuals would be pulled from their seats on the trains and thrown off the moving train. Security guards, policemen, even Boy Scouts would go car to car and pull off people who looked Jewish. It didn't even matter if those people were Jewish. Looking Jewish was enough, and so they'd throw you off the moving train, or they would beat you to death in the train car, or they would shoot you right there. So this violence was pervasive. And again, this is a mode that people had switched on to survive the war. They had been rewarded for violence. They had not been punished for violence, and so this continued. There was also extreme anti-German violence after the war. Understandably, Eastern Europeans blamed Germany for the war, were furious at Germany, and they took their anger out on the ethnic German population. So these people, these ethnic Germans, have lived in territory that now belonged to Poland or Czechoslovakia or Hungary. And the governments and the citizens there decided, well, we want these ethnic Germans out of our country. So ancestral lands, farms that these people had been there for hundreds of years, and now suddenly they'd get a knock on the door. Hello, you have an hour to pack your things. If you are still here when we get back, we will kill you. And so this type of anti-German, these forced population transfers, actually resulted in the largest single refugee movement in European history. And many people did not survive the journey from wherever it was that they were to German territory. People died of exposure, exhaustion, starvation. So again, just because the war is over does not mean that the violence has stopped. Next slide, please. Thanks. And so in this context, people are ripe for communism. People were looking for stability, some sort of strong force to impose order and make life bearable again. Part of the groundwork for the communist takeover was laid at Yalta. Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt met at Yalta in 1945 and divided Eastern Europe, into spheres of influence. Now, the Allies didn't mean, okay, Stalin, you can have complete control over Eastern Europe. The idea was each country can decide what it wants to do. For example, Poland will be guaranteed free and fair democratic elections. The US and UK will have 50% influence, and Stalin will have 50% influence there. So it was going to be a balance where countries could decide what they wanted, but they would have close diplomatic ties to the Soviet Union. As we know, that is not what actually happened. But this is kind of the groundwork for the eventual communist takeover was laid at Yalta. Secondly, there were Soviet boots on the ground. So the Red Army came in from the east and liberated these Eastern European countries from the Nazis and from fascist collaborationist regimes, and then they stayed. So if you don't like communism, well, go tell that to the Red Army garrison down the block, right? You're not going to protest if you have the military might of the Soviet Union staring you right in the face. Third reason is that Eastern Europe was terrified of Germany. They had seen what Germany could do, and they wanted anybody to protect them against their neighbor. Fourth, the Soviet Union had actually laid plans to occupy or control Eastern Europe after the war, particularly in Poland. Stalin recognized that invasions of the Soviet Union had often historically taken place by troops marching through Poland. So if Stalin could create a buffer zone in Poland, then he could protect the Soviet Union. So in order to lay the groundwork for control of Poland after the war, the Soviets went about removing Polish individuals who could potentially resist the Soviets after the war. So one example here is the Katyn massacre of 1940, where Soviet troops murdered, I believe, 16,000, possibly more, members of the Polish military, so officers and other members of the intelligentsia, priests, professors, societal leaders who could have formed opposition to Soviet rule after the war. And by removing these people, Stalin was making it easier to then control Poland eventually. And then the Warsaw Uprising is another example. The Polish Home Army rose up against Nazi occupation, fought for control of the city, and this battle was extremely brutal. And the Polish Home Army was decimated. The Soviet army was right across the river watching this battle happen, did nothing, didn't go to the Polish Home Army's help at all because, at least in part, they decided, well, if we don't get involved, then the Nazis will do our dirty work of removing potential anti-communist resistors. And so it will be easier for us to control Poland after the war if these home army heroes are no longer around. Fifth, the communists had distinguished themselves during the war. So communists were targeted by the Nazis and put in concentration camps. And people observed these communists in the camps and saw that they behaved with solidarity. And they were largely seen as having comported themselves with dignity and having lived up to their ideals. And this was something that other people wanted. It was very attractive. So there was that component. And then there was also the fact that the communists had distinguished themselves militarily. So in the top right, you can see Marshal Tito and his communist partisan command. Tito was a partisan and the eventual leader of Yugoslavia. And he and his partisans, they liberated Yugoslavia themselves. They were a communist force, and they didn't need Allied assistance. The Allied forces did not come in to liberate Yugoslavia. Tito and the communists did it themselves. So he had extreme local legitimacy. You know, the communists were the liberators of the people. And there were communist partisan bands across Eastern Europe who had fought bravely. And additionally, the Red Army had been the ones to finally liberate Eastern Europe. And so the communists were seen as heroes. People were extremely grateful to them for what they had done. So there was that component as well of people really admired the communists. And then finally, there were ideological reasons for people to be inclined toward communism. First of all, both fascism and democracy had been discredited. Democracy in the Great Depression. Eastern Europe was an agricultural region hit extremely hard by the Great Depression, and Western democracies at that point were isolationist and did nothing to help Eastern Europe in Eastern Europe's view. They felt that they had been betrayed and that they had been left ripe for Hitler to come in and take over. And so they viewed, well, democracy failed us, so we don't want to try that. Of course, fascism had also failed them. They had just seen during the war, what fascism does. They don't want to go back to that. They considered social democracy, but as kind of a third way between democracy and communism. But the communists basically subsumed the social democratic parties into the Communist Party over time. And so that wasn't really an option. But even if it had been, communism was appealing all on its own. First of all, communism sees no race, religion, or ethnicity. So if you have just survived a brutal war where you were persecuted and murdered specifically for reasons of race, religion, and ethnicity, it's extremely appealing to live in a regime that is explicitly telling you, we don't care what race you are, what religion you are, what ethnicity you are. None of that matters. You can belong to the Communist Party. You are part of the country, no matter what you identify as. And obviously this isn't true, but this is the standard party line, and people believed it. There was also pro-communist propaganda. So people who had survived the war by going to the USSR, they returned to their homes in Eastern Europe and told these glorious stories of all of the food and how wonderful people are and how great the regime is. Again, lies, but the local population in Eastern Europe had no way to know. And then thirdly, there was an extreme desire to avoid repeating the past. So we have to make the sacrifices of the past and the loss of life worth it. And we need to find a new way forward. We haven't tried communism yet. Maybe this is the thing that is going to save us from war and genocide, and it is worth it to try it. So that is where we are at 1947 in Eastern Europe, where the communists come in and solidify their control over the region. Thanks.
Claire, fantastic, and bang on time as well. All right, Vicky, over to you. Tough act to follow. Vicky, you're still muted.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you here from Metz, France, actually in the classroom at Georgia Tech Lorraine, our campus here in Europe, with a room full of students. So I am wearing my mask. Thank you, Alistair, and thank you, Claire. I'll get started right away. My job is to try to explain what the landscape after the battle, as Ian Buruma puts it in his book, 2013 book, Year Zero. First slide, Chris. Second slide, actually. Next slide. Thank you. Tony Judt, in his magisterial work, Post-War Europe, captured this chaos in this short phrase. Surviving the war was one thing, surviving the peace was another. He then proceeded to write almost 900 pages to tell us about, again, this atmosphere in Europe after the Second World War. Ian Buruma would then publish a book in 2013 describing, again, this moment in history. For him, Year Zero was 1945. He spent 400 pages. I'm going to try to get through this in 15 minutes. And what I want to talk about is this notion of surviving the peace. And the peace indeed was very, very precarious. There's some overlap with what Claire just described in Eastern Europe. And what I will try to pull out is these three dimensions: the human loss, economic devastation, material destruction, the dimension of psychological and emotional trauma, and lastly, what the sociocultural and political climate was. and all the divisions across Western Europe. Next slide, please. If you'll permit me, I'm going to put the end of World War II in very brief and very partial historical context. This map is from Professor John Morrow, who was with us yesterday, from his, I think, definitive book on World War I. And I'm not going to read his quote. I just simply want to draw your attention to this one significant fact, and that is the wars that had preceded, even the Franco-Prussian War and certainly the First World War, had really decimated the male populations. World War I, these figures are 35% of German men from the age 19 to 32 were killed at the end of World War I. For France, and these numbers, you have to look at them with some skepticism, though at least for the French men ages 20 to 32 at the outbreak of the war, at least 50% of them were dead by the end of the war. 4 million were declared official war wounded or invalids. And the reason I mention this is because it's not to try to understand the connection between World War I and World War II, but this next bullet point that I have raises this issue, a concept that Professor Morrow talks about in his book, of the 30 Years' War, the second 30 Years' War on the continent of Europe. And that is, or some people would say, and it was the peace at the end, 1919, the peace to end all peace. E.H. Carr would talk about the 20-year crisis, 1919 to 1939. And what I want to draw your attention to is that 20-year period was just enough time for both Germany and France to replenish the male population to fight the next war, the continuation of this deadly rivalry that ended up in 2 worldwide conflagrations. Next slide, please. And I think that's important as we look at the victory. A lot of this was drawn out in the presentations yesterday, but I want to draw your attention to this newspaper, the Daily Telegraph. This is a British newspaper, and this was published on May the 3rd or 4th after significant battles led by Montgomery in Holland and Northwest Germany and Denmark. And if you note what I've highlighted here, the caption reads, this day will probably go down in history as an end to the second 30 Years' War, the war which began in 1914, continued for the next 5.5 years, and ended in 1944. So I think it's really important to think about the language that is being used as we talk about the long view of Europe as a bloody continent ravaged with war, and why World War II would this time be the end would be very different. Colonel Woodcock talked about the surrender. You see here in General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France, the surrender signed on May the 7th, but I've also included a photo here of the surrender in Germany. This one was in Berlin, and it was signed by the highest German commander, Field Marshal Keitel. And the reason I include it here is not to talk about the conditions of the surrender, but to draw your attention to the fact that this really, he was widely known as Hitler's yes man. He would be the first and most notorious war criminal who would be tried in 1946 in Nuremberg and sentenced to death and executed by hanging in 1946. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about, just for a moment, my presentation isn't completely linear because I want to go back. These are scenes from 1944. And I have as a title, Your Euphoria for a Moment, because indeed the joy and the jubilation of having survived the war was very ephemeral and very fleeting. However, I draw your attention to this one photograph. This is the Paris Town Hall. And if you'll notice, you can make out that there are French and American flags on the windows, but the largest flag you see is the Croix de Lorraine. That has significance, especially for this region of France, but it was a masterful strategy of de Gaulle. Colonel Woodcock pointed out a bit of this, his liberation of Paris, but using this flag would really capture the immediate aftermath, the feeling in France of having survived the war and the occupation, and de Gaulle wanted to delegitimize the Vichy regime, because after all, France had been occupied by the Nazis with only 1,500 German functionaries. So the issue of collaborationists versus resistance, de Gaulle was quite aware that that was going to create a bloodbath of revenge and violence. So he uses this flag, the Croix de Lorraine, to symbolize the strength, the moral courage, and to try to unify the nation around this symbol, and essentially to martyrize the resistance. Next slide, please. Just a few comments on the loss of life. The statistics tell it all. I'd like to thank my student, Jack Sheldon, who helped compile this data and this graph. I'm really just going to move quickly here and point out, I think, the overarching fact that Tony Judt emphasizes in his book as well, is that this war was a civilian experience. No other conflict in history had killed so many people in such a short time. The most striking number of non-combatant civilians, 19 million or more than half of the deaths. And certainly this was the case, as you can see, the Allied civilians, 58% of the deaths. Some other facts about just the sheer death. We're all, I think, aware that 6 million people perished in concentration camps. 5.7 million of those were Jews. Over 200,000 were Roma or Gypsies, but we should also remember that Hitler and the Nazis targeted all manner of other groups, including homosexuals, communists, and the handicapped. Claire talked about some of the loss of life, and just to contrast, even though the death and the devastation was maybe more gruesome, certainly on the Eastern Front, the battles were more deadly. And Poland lost 1 in every 5 of her pre-war population. And in some of the Western countries, it was much, much smaller. Greece being where the most loss of life occurred, 1 in every 14. In Germany, it was 1 for every 15. In France, 1 for every 77. And in Britain, 1 person lost his or her life out of 125. Next slide, please. This next slide just shows, puts this also in comparative context, just in terms of how much the situation and the death toll varied from country to country. The German occupation across Western Europe was not as harsh as I've already mentioned. You can see, however, that there was a great deal of variation or distinction really between some of these smaller countries. So Belgian loss of life was considerably less than half that of the Netherlands, and part of that is because Belgium, like France in the liberation of Paris anyway, the battles would continue in the Netherlands well into 1945, and that's where a lot of the loss of life occurred in those later years. And I just a word about the economic devastation. This just shows the general economic setback of the war. I'm going to ask you to advance, please. The next slide shows that even though West Europeans were liberated, but they had very empty stomachs. Many of you are aware of the widespread famine that existed during the war. There was massive agricultural devastation, farms destroyed, cattle destroyed. By 1944 and 1945, French agricultural production was 40% of what it had been prior to the war, or in the 1930s. Famine and food shortage would continue up through 1947. You see this image of the hunger winter in Austria. Austrians were living on 800 calories a day, and they began to strike. The sign that you see there is, we want bread and coal. My battery is dying. Excuse me. France as you all, I'm sure, can appreciate, the baguette and bread is sacred in France, and France was so happy to get rid of the ration cards in 1945, but then they would have a severe bread shortage, flour shortage, so they had to bring back the bread ration tickets, and there were also riots across France. So bottom line is about 50% of the total food supply was devastated. And from that, there were a multitude of health risks, from vitamin deficiency, but also people were eating things they should not be eating. And I came across reports of caution about eating stewed cat. There were warnings to be careful about what was consumed, and other diseases that would flow from this shortage of food would be dysentery and a whole host of other diseases, rickets, tuberculosis, and so forth. Next slide, please. These images capture the material destruction. A lot of the material damage came at by the Allied aerial bombings that took place after D-Day. This on your left is the image of Caen, the town of Caen, which was absolutely eviscerated. Some of the right hand is Rotterdam. Rotterdam being the most important port in the Netherlands, but also Europe. The Nazis devastated, basically just flattened Rotterdam early in the war. Other material destruction was obviously the industrial production. Infrastructure was decimated. In France, the industrial production was about 1/3 of what it had been in 1929. Half the bridges and rails had been destroyed. 2/3 of the French merchant ships had been sunk. Transportation was devastated. In Germany, 3 out of every 4 houses were destroyed. The last thing I'll mention, going back to the Dutch case, one of the first things the Germans did when they invaded the Netherlands is they stole all the bicycles. And you know how much our Dutch friends love and depend on their bicycles. The last thing the Germans did was flood the lands. Over 200,000 hectares of land were destroyed or flooded by the Germans, which also wiped out their pre-war rail and canal transportation. Next slide, please. The last image I want to show is, you saw it yesterday. I'll just, this on the left is the destruction of the Belgian town of Antwerp. And on the right, you see Berlin, an image of the Soviet flag being hung over the burning Reichstag. And the reason Colonel Woodcock, I believe, or someone had this image as well. And the reason I want to bring it up again is because, of course, the Soviets were our allies, and we absolutely depended on them for victory. And as we move into the Cold War in the later sections, it's important also to remember what happened. And I think this sets up well the next theme, which is the psychological trauma, because the Soviet soldiers were reported to have raped 90,000 women in Berlin during their rampage of the city. Professor Goodman mentioned urban warfare in his talk yesterday. This was probably the most nefarious and brutal and violent example of that. The Soviets would proceed into Austria, where over 87,000 women were reported by clinics and doctors to have been raped in the 3 weeks following the arrival of the Red Army there. Next slide, please. And I think this captures some of the psychological and emotional trauma. Yes.
I'm afraid we have to call it there. You're out of time, and we need to leave General Breedlove time for his presentation.
Okay. I stop there, and maybe I can come back for 5 minutes after General Breedlove.
Okay, well, all right.
Alistair, why don't we let her finish? Why don't we let her finish? I can adjust because Vicky's on a roll. Go ahead.
Okay.
No, I won't even look at my notes. I apologize. I'll just quickly show that the violence against women was not just limited to the Soviet soldiers' mass rape. It also would happen to women across Western Europe by at the hands of their own angry countrymen. These are images of women whose heads had been sheared and shaved in the streets of Paris and Marseille. And they were accused of horizontal collaboration, or as Gertrude Stein would call it, keeping company with the Germans. This was absolutely devastating and the subject of many actually movies and works of art. I have to move quickly. I'll just say that it wasn't restricted to France. In the Netherlands, women were actually tarred and feathered. Next slide. So the emotional trauma would be particularly harsh. Claire actually touched on this. Next slide, please. Claire touched on this. We cannot have any presentation without discussing what Tony Judt reminds us is the one and most important thing we all have to remember and know, and that is Auschwitz. And instead of showing you images that you're familiar with of the liberated camps, I think you saw some of that in one of the presentations yesterday. I just wanted to introduce, if you don't know, Simone Weil, who passed away a couple of years ago. She was a heroic Auschwitz survivor. She actually survived Auschwitz and the death march to the Belsen camp. And I think this is from her memoirs. And Claire's presentation, I think, encapsulated this too for many of the survivors, the Jewish survivors in the East. But I think it's something that has been described as a syndrome. And if you've visited any Jewish memorial museums, you've certainly been, you've encountered this. And this notion that the Jewish people or other concentration camp survivors would return having, survived physically and trying to hold, their humanity intact, but not from any help from their neighbors and compatriots. Again, this kind of echoes something that Claire brought up, and Simone Weil would say that, she really didn't talk about the fact that she had survived. She had been deported when she was 17 years old, and she was a minister, a public official, before she actually raised her sleeve and showed her tattoo from Auschwitz, which incidentally she had engraved on her sword. The picture you see in her distinguished outfit is when she was inducted into the Académie Française, and she put three things on her sword: the motto of the French Republic, the European Union motto, and her Auschwitz tattoo. I'm going to stop there in deference to General Breedlove. I'd like to come back, if I could, for 2 minutes after his conclusion, which would set Dr. Weber up nicely. Thank you very much, and I apologize for going over my time.
All right, General, over to you.
Thank you, first of all, for allowing me to be here today and to talk. And additionally, I want to throw out the invitation to tomorrow, where we're also going to have some fun as we talk about technology in this conflict and how it changed things. This is a subject near and dear to my heart. The operational modes following World War II resulted in really defined the first 14 years of my military service in the Cold War. And the institutions, which will be talked about next, defined the last 25 years of my service, including culminating as the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, during a time where we were trying to hug the bear and the bear didn't want to be hugged. So military thinkers and historians know Karl von Clausewitz. His book on war is very famous, and his famous statement in that book that war is the continuation of politics by other means is very important to what I'll say today, because everything from here out is sort of about that theme of connection of politics to military actions in the post-war. It's important to note that really what happened after the war was shaped by what happened before the war. As you heard previously, the way World War I ended and the way that Russia was trying to shape Europe previous to World War II had a big impact. modern-day Ukraine, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Belarus, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Armenia had already been annexed in 1939. In 39 to 40 is the Winter War, where Russia annexed Finnish territory. And then the Soviets annexed their first territories in eastern Poland in September of 39. And of course, in 40, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states. So the shape, the landscape, and how the post-war divide of Europe would fall out had already been shaped. Similarly, the alliance that fought for the West, or in our alliance during the war, actually started falling apart long before the war ended as well. Probably the biggest indicators were Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill having a fierce disagreement over the resolution of who was going to be in the Polish government, the Western recognized group or the Eastern recognized group. And Stalin was said to be furious over the delayed invasion on the Western Front. Why was Normandy taking so long? Why was the Western Front not taking pressure off the Soviet Union? And in fact, before the war even ended, many felt that the war between the Soviet Union and the United States was already inevitable. You've had a magnificent description of how Europe looked as the war ended. Just to hit a few more high points. By the end of the war, the European economy had collapsed and 70% of its industrial infrastructure was destroyed. That's a roll-up, of course, of all of the country. You heard how tough the war was on Russia. We need to be intellectually honest and recognize 26.6 million dead, 8.7 of those in combat, the rest due to starvation, famine, and disease. 25% loss of Russia's capital assets. A rundown, I think they were covered, but just to think, over 1,700 cities and towns, 70,000 villages, and 32,000 industrial establishments in Russia alone destroyed. Germany has been well covered. Almost 9% of the population lost. And by the end of the war, and what the Allies did at the end of the war, almost 50% of its industrial capacity ruined. The UK, we don't talk a lot about. They lost less in numbers of people, about 360,000. But their economy was completely destroyed. One of the quotes I love about Britain is that its war that was described as a millstone around the neck of the British economy and what it was going to take to recover that great nation. I'm going to skip my words on hatred. Just alone in the Holocaust, as you heard, approximately 6 million killed in the camps. The hatred of the Russians for the Germans. The Russian total distrust of all their allies. And the fact that at the end of the war, as you heard described, immense numbers of deployed forces. You heard a little bit yesterday, and I'm sure you're going to hear a little bit more as a real historian speaks in a minute, about Yalta and Potsdam. I think that Yalta is very important in February of 45. Roosevelt, Churchill, Stalin. The West was very divided. Stalin was focused on a Soviet sphere of influence to build a buffer against a future Germany. The agreement had some really tough points. The Germans were to be held to an unconditional surrender. You heard yesterday a great description of how that surrender was not going to be totally unconditional, but at Yalta it was forced. Stalin made some concessions, which made everybody think he was on board. But what we find out in history that many of those concessions were never delivered. And the Soviet Union said it was okay with the UN if they were on the Security Council, and that would give them, of course, a veto. Potsdam, a great question asked yesterday and already mentioned today. new players, Truman and Attlee, and they were just not as ready as Stalin to hold the line at Potsdam. Stalin had already been failing on some of his promises of self-determination of these lands that had been grabbed during and before the war. And so Potsdam came out with a division of Germany and Berlin. And in an ugly turn of events, a recognition of the Soviet-controlled Polish government. And so you'll hear more later. You're going to hear how those two conferences really shaped things, but I think they're important to understand some of what we did. Of course, speaking a little bit to tomorrow's technology, the war started ending, especially in the East, in the Far East, with the atomic bombing of Japan. What does that have to do with today's discussion? Well, the Soviet Union was set to invade Japan on the 15th. Truman had sort of mentioned in the conference we just talked about to Stalin that there was a new powerful weapon on the making. Of course, Stalin, their intelligence was wonderful, and he already knew of what Truman spoke. But some historians, and I agree, believe that, as Truman said, that he preferred to keep the Soviet Union out of the Pacific War, and therefore the timing of the bombings on the 6th of August and 9th of August to try to keep the Soviet Union out of, especially out of post-war dealings with Japan. And some think this bravado or this show of nuclear prowess at the part of the United States was also a warning to the Soviet Union. And most of us truly believe that it effectively ended either side's desire to continue working together and really marked the beginning of the cold part of the Cold War and the nuclear arms race that came out of it. It's important to note, as the war came to end with Russia's forces deployed, as was so aptly described yesterday, that Russia was hell-bent on building a barrier between them and a capitalist West that they actually saw themselves at war with. The pre- and post-war actions that we mentioned in Finland, the Baltics and Poland, the portioning of Germany, building the West German country that I served in for so long, and the East German or German Democratic Republic in the East, and the curtain and the beginning of the wall, all of these became symptoms of this intense distrust of the Russians and needing to build their protection. The sinews of speech, peace speech, boy, that was hard to say. The sinews of peace speech of Winston Churchill. I like the words that he used. He said, "A shadow has fallen over Europe." He described Stalin as having dropped an iron curtain between the East and the West. And that Stalin responded by charging that coexistence between communist countries and the West was impossible. And so the next 40 to 50 years of our life were determined. And we'll talk more tomorrow, so I'll just give you a teaser today. Then in mid-1948, the Soviet Union imposed a blockade on the western zone of occupation in Berlin. And airlift made its debut in a big way on the world. Teaser for tomorrow. The West was very busy in exacting revenge and reparations, you pick your word, from Germany. And they were beginning to keep a very wary eye on Russia. As we said before, the European economy had collapsed. Infrastructure was destroyed. There was an occupying army on both sides. And those armies were doing some good, and they were also doing some bad. And you heard all of the horrors of recovery of the people, as it was mentioned. This was a war about the non-combatants as much as it was a war about the combatants. Germany would lose a quarter of its pre-war territory. And the policy that originally was being executed by the Allies was to extract further reparations from Germany. And it was over 2 years before it was rightly decided that West Germany was going to be absolutely required to the recovery of Europe. And I'll leave that to Dr. Weber in just a few minutes. The mindset that we should change, let me say, as a military man, one of the very first public discussions was by our military. After lobbying by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Lucius D. Clay and George Marshall, the Truman administration accepted that an economic recovery in Europe could not go forward without the reconstruction of the German industrial base. And that conversation was started by our generals. In the long telegram, Keenan brought forward the policy that would dominate for some years, and that is a policy of containment. I want to just bring up 2 points about that policy that later, as the commander of NATO, I struggled with. One, the solution was to strengthen Western institutions in order to render them invulnerable to the Soviet challenge, while awaiting the mellowing of the Soviet regime. A second point, the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be a long-term, patient but firm, and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. I read those words for words because I'm still frustrated by the lack of recognition of what we faced in Russia then. And I was later frustrated as the SACEUR when we had come through a period of trying to embrace Russia and bring them to our Western values. Yet we saw them invade Georgia in 2008. We saw them invade the Ukraine twice in the spring of 2014. And so it seems that even in the end of World War II, as we tried to figure out our path forward with Russia, we were underestimating them. I don't have time to discuss an interesting thing called Operation Drop Shot. We'll talk maybe some more tomorrow if we have time about that. Operation Drop Shot, where American and Western planners actually considered the use of nuclear weapons in a conventional war with the Soviet Union. An interesting conversation to have at that time. And then finally, I'm going to close out and just only mention that the 3 institutions, which I'm pretty sure Dr. Weber is going to talk about, the UN, the NATO, and EU, these sprung from all of the concerns at the end of this war. I love the first NATO Sec Gen's words, and when he famously stated that the organization's goal was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. And I'll leave that for a real scholar to explain here in a few minutes. Thanks for your time today. Please join us tomorrow as we talk about technology. Please give your full attention to a really great teacher who's going to follow next. Thank you.
Thank you, General. All right, shall we give Vicki her 2 more minutes to tee up Katya again? She's already teed up pretty well.
Better introduction and lead in than Breedlove, but I'll just show you one slide. If you'll advance the slides, please, Chris. Advance. There, thank you. Just a note to say that this threat of communism that was perceived by Marshall and other American officials was also something very serious to contend with in Western Europe. And as Claire said, the communists had kind of distinguished themselves during the war, and this was certainly the case in France, where the most numerous elements in the resistance were also members of the Communist Party. And so I put 2 slides here on the left, 2 pictures. This is an image of the French Communist Party poster and a poster for de Gaulle. And de Gaulle was a staunch anti-communist, but he knew that he had to form a coalition with his communist compatriots. And I think that this is really important. These numbers just speak for themselves. In the first elections held in France and Italy, at the ballot box, Communist Party, the Communist Party was garnering 26% of the vote in France, for example. If you'll just advance the slide, Chris. I can't talk about that. Advance there. So you see, this is a very famous poster with Stalin and his reach, and you see the big question mark over France. Because these Communist Party, they were also ideologically diverse, but the heads of the party and those elected were taking orders from the Soviet Union. And Molotov, the Russian Soviet foreign minister, would you advance the slide, please? Would be, and this was increasingly apparent, and this date from this really excellent biography of the Marshall Plan itself said that the real birth date of the Cold War was July the 7th, 1947, and this is when Molotov basically pulled out of Marshall Plan pre-discussions, actually it preceded, and this is where Europe, formerly divided between allies and former enemies and neutrals, really became divided between Marshall states and the Soviet bloc. And I think Katya is going to unpack and explain that much better and in greater detail than I could do. So thanks for your extra attention, and again, apologies for going over.
Thank you, Vicki. All right, okay, we've been set up by both General Breedlove and by Vicki, so over to you.
Okay. This is a tough act to follow, and after 2 days and being the last speaker now on today's panel, many of the things I wanted to say have been at least hinted toward. So some of my comments will be shorter on some of these topics, but my role is to look at the new political and institutional geography in the period 1945 to 1950. I also draw largely on Tony Judd's post-war history of Europe since 1945, which I think many of us see as one of the main works on historical accounts of this period. You've already heard that following World War II, the fate of Europe was in the hands of the US and the Soviet Union. And my colleagues, of course, have discussed the utter destruction, the homelessness, hunger, disease, and so on. And of course, you now heard from many of the presenters the sobering statistics that between 1939 and 1945, over 36 million Europeans died from war-related causes. Next slide, please. From 1945 to 1950, there were three main concerns. The West feared a Soviet-orchestrated communist subversion. The Soviets and their satellites distrusted the West, feared capitalist encirclement, and worried about the US's nuclear superiority. And of course, the Europeans very much feared a resurgent Germany. So these concerns gave rise to the need for political and economic restructuring. But before I get to that, I just want to stress a few points. First, it needs to be understood from the outset that the US had no plans to stay in Europe for any extended period of time, because that, of course, would be very costly to the US taxpayers. It also hoped that the UN, which was already being planned at the end of the war, would handle the problems of political security and economic recovery. And it was hoped that free elections would solve the problems of Germany and Eastern Europe. Now, to determine how Europe would be organized and who would control it, several conferences took place at the closing stages of the war, and over time, various institutions and alliances were created to stabilize Europe. Next slide, please. You've repeatedly now heard about the Yalta Conference in February 1945, so I'll just reiterate that there Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt discussed the post-war organization of Eastern Europe. They agreed on the creation of interim governments that would be representative of democratic elements. And of course, it was at Yalta where Stalin pledged free elections. Next slide, please. Yalta was followed by the Potsdam Conference, which also now has been referred to repeatedly from 17th July till 2nd of August in 1945. And here we see Roosevelt being replaced by Truman, Churchill eventually by Attlee, and of course Stalin, the only one who had been in attendance at the previous conferences. Three things were really important about Potsdam. First, it was agreed there should be the expulsion of Germans from Eastern Europe. It was decided on the division of Germany into occupation zones, and there should be democratization, denazification, and decartelization. Now, the Soviets denied that they were interfering in several of the East European countries, but they did agree to meet in Paris to draft 5 proposed peace treaties. The other thing that's important to mention about Potsdam is that agreement on Germany's new borders with Poland could not be accomplished at that Potsdam conference. Next slide, please. Brings us to the conference in Paris, July to October 1946. Actually, it was multiple meetings, obviously. So here, peace treaties were signed with Italy, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, and Finland. But the conference largely, as was already mentioned, focused on territorial, economic, and political terms. The defeated states also had to reduce their weapons and their armed forces. And both the East and the West now perceived the control of Germany as essential to their security. Next slide, please. So then a whole lot of attention began to revolve around what became known as the German question, namely a post-war settlement in Germany, because at the time, many people thought that the only good Germans basically were dead Germans after all the chaos they had created and all the suffering during World War II. So in 1945, US Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau initially proposed the permanent destruction of German power by essentially destroying the heavy industry of the country and turning Germany into an agricultural economy. But many in the US thought that this was too extreme, and so instead they favored sticking to demilitarization, denazification, and curtailing German industry rather than entirely destroying it. Especially as the US-Soviet relations became more strained, the US, of course, realized it needed Germany to offset that Soviet threat. So demolishing its industry was no longer favored. And yet, there was the thinking that as long as the US was the only country which possessed nuclear weapons, the threat, of course, would be manageable. Next slide, please. It is also noteworthy that the UK and France wanted to restrict German power. France initially also sought the complete disarmament and economic dismantling of Germany. And moreover, it wanted the mining districts of the Ruhr, the Saarland, and parts of the Rhineland to be separated from Germany. So these territories that you see here marked on the left side of the map next to the French occupation zone. We'll get to that in a moment. So they wanted these mining districts to essentially these resources to be placed under French disposal. But this would have destroyed Germany for many years to come. And so in 1947, France gave up this extreme position because it recognized three things. It recognized Germany wouldn't be dismantled, that German recovery was necessary to improve the dire economic situation, and of course, France increasingly was cognizant of the increasing Soviet threat. So then ultimately, France realized if it wanted economic recovery and some sort of US and British security guarantee against a resurgent Germany or an expansionist Soviet Union, France would have to go along with the other Western powers. So France then decided to Europeanize the German problem, that is, to integrate Germany into Europe. The idea was to prevent Germany from doing military harm while allowing it to do good economically. So there was agreement early on regarding the principles of surrender, demilitarization, and the powers to be exercised by the Allied Control Council. Also, it was decided that France should participate in Germany's occupation. Yesterday, we already talked about the fact that it was not present at the Potsdam Treaty, but then later, of course, the European statesmen, US, decided that France should participate. And therefore, the US then carved out an occupation district for France from the United States zone in the southwest part of Germany. So on that map, of course, you see in blue the French sector, the yellow represents the American sector, Soviet Union in red, and the British sector in green. And obviously note that in the Soviet sector, you see Berlin, which also divided into the four different Allied parts. While the US in its occupation zone promoted re-education, denazification, and democracy to the extent possible, the Soviets, as you've already heard, established a de facto communist-led government in their zone. Moreover, most West Europeans were ruled by coalitions of the left, or left-center politicians, or Christian democratic parties. And many of these politicians, many who had entered politics decades before, people like Winston Churchill, Attlee, de Gasperi, and of course Konrad Adenauer, sought an enhanced role for the state in economic affairs and the creation of welfare states in their countries. They understood that the main goal had to be the recovery of the continent's economy to promote stability and to promote reform. Also, it was essential to rebuild housing, transportation, to counter the food shortages, again, the problems that my colleagues so well outlined in their presentations. So as you can tell by my name and as you can tell by my accent, I'm originally from Germany. I've now lived in the US for 40 years. So I consider myself a Germanican, as my friends say. So having grown up in Germany, my parents, who were children during the war, my father was born in 1936, my mother in 1938. To this day, my parents talk about how hungry they were during the war and in its immediate aftermath. They tell the story how each family member's initial was carved in a loaf of bread and how everyone got one slice a day. They also have great stories about how American GIs shared some of their rations with them and gave them chocolate and gum. My mother received Quaker meals. And just as a last sort of story through the lenses of my parents, my father also often recounts how he, as a young boy, was hiding out with a friend in the cemetery in my hometown of Worms, the Diet of Worms. You're familiar with it. So my father was hiding out in the cemetery at night, essentially with the order from his mom to jump on a freight train and throw down pieces of coal to keep from freezing to death in winter. As you might imagine, this was a high-risk endeavor because if he and his friend had gotten caught, they would have been shot. Now onward with my presentation. Now one needs to understand that the leaders on both sides were convinced that their opponents had aggressive intentions and that they sought control. They sought to control Europe through the control of Germany. Next slide, please. So, hence, in February of 1946, the first secretary in the US Embassy in Moscow, George Kennan, then predicted, if the abysmal conditions in Europe were to continue, communism would become rather attractive. And you can read the whole quote there. But therefore, Kennan essentially proposed the famous policy of containment to deal with what was perceived to be a political threat. And that's really important. At this point in time, the threat was political. It was the fear of Soviet infiltration, of communism. It was not a military threat at the time. Slide, please. 1 month later, in March 1946, Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech, which General Breedlove just referred to, where he argued that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent. Very famous speech that everybody, of course, is familiar with. Next slide, please. Then, on 12th of March, 1947, President Truman informed Congress, it must be the policy of the US to support free peoples who are resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressure. So he issued the Truman Doctrine to protect against communist infiltration and takeover. Next slide, please. Because knowing that the UK could no longer afford to aid Greece and Turkey, the US now pledged economic and financial aid to nations that were threatened by communism. And here again, of course, you have the famous wording in the Truman Doctrine. Next slide, please. Shortly thereafter, US Secretary of State George Marshall came up with a plan for a European recovery program, which he announced at a commencement speech at Harvard on June 5th, 1947. Of course, it became the famous Marshall Plan. Next slide, please. And I want to spend a little bit of time with it because it was so important for the recovery of Western Europe. So why was this Marshall Plan so successful? Many people have asked. And I think, first of all, it was successful because the European countries had to plan ahead and calculate future investment needs. Moreover, to manage these European recovery funds, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEC, set up in 1948. There's a lot of structure given and planning to this recovery effort. And so then between 1947 and 51, the combined GNP of Western Europe rose by 30%. That was really astonishing. Also, the Marshall Plan, of course, would benefit the US by restoring Europe as a trade partner, Western Europe. When Marshall Aid ended in December 51, the US had spent $13 billion. And just to put that in perspective, that at the beginning of the 21st century would cost $201 billion. So this was a significant amount of financial support that was given to help the war-torn economies of Europe to be rebuilt. Also, the post-war recovery of industrialized countries in the West was facilitated by a new international monetary system. It was established in July 1944 at the conference at Bretton Woods. And here, the financial representatives of the Allied nations discussed how to promote the resumption of world trade and capital movements. And since I am to talk about institutions, obviously, as you all know, Bretton Woods gave rise to three very important institutions: the International Monetary Fund, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, now the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the third institution coming out of Bretton Woods was the World Bank. So IMF, GATT, and World Bank. And I also want to stress that although aid was offered to all European countries, no East European countries received Marshall aid since the USSR dissuaded the East Europeans from participating. Next slide, please. So what was the rationale for this Marshall Plan? In the early post-war period, it was recognized that the danger to the West was not military but political in nature. Again, the greatest threat at the time was, if Western European countries' economies were to collapse, communists might come to power in these countries. Therefore, the best defense was to increase the economic health of Western Europe to contain this political threat. Next, let's look at the military developments and formation of post-war alliances. Here, the British feared that the US withdrawal from Europe because the Europeans would, of course, not be strong enough to defend themselves against the Soviet Union. As a result, the British decided in 1947 to move ahead with their own nuclear program. And the French also desired military protection against Germany. Next slide, please. Now, to signal to the US that they were doing what they could to defend themselves against the possibility of a resurgent Germany, in February of 1947, the British and the French signed the Dunkirk Treaty, pledging mutual support against future German aggression. Also in the spring of the same year, 1947, meetings discussing a peace treaty for Germany continued, but no agreement could be reached at that stage. So then in February 1948, Britain, France, and the US began tripartite discussions on Germany's future. And now at the same time, several events led to an increased threat perception. And that's where the Cold War starts to heat up. On February 22nd, the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia staged a successful coup and seized control of the government in Prague. In March, US General Clay, who at the time was stationed in Berlin, sent a telegram to the US administration suggesting war might come with dramatic suddenness. Denmark also feared a Soviet invasion. Next slide, please. So in March 1948, the Dunkirk Treaty then was extended to the Brussels Pact. And in addition to France and UK, the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, were now added. Now, this Brussels Pact was a mutual defense alliance, which was to last for 50 years. And since British security needs were no longer separable from those of the continent, in January 1948, Britain had already called for a common defense strategy, namely a Western Union, and it was officially inaugurated with this Brussels Pact, with the signing of the Brussels. Then, on the 1st of April 1948, we see the beginning of the Berlin blockade that General Breedlove will speak more about tomorrow. But with it, of course, Stalin tried to force the Allies to quit Berlin, but they responded with an incredible airlift, which saved the population of Berlin from starvation and freezing to death. Now, as a result of these developments, which increased the level of threat significantly, it became clear to the US that it would need to play a more active role to defend Europe. So this then is when we see the beginning of secret North Atlantic Treaty talks, initially between the US, the UK, and Canada. And during these secret talks, the three allies discussed various modes of transatlantic security cooperation. I can't really go into much detail, but one model was proposed as a two-pillar model consisting of the US and Canada in one pillar, and then the second pillar would be made up of West European countries. That was not something Canada supported because it feared that it would be dwarfed by the US. The US at one point made a unilateral presidential guarantee. The Europeans didn't like this because they feared that a future president might not uphold this presidential guarantee. And so all kinds of proposals were debated, and most important became the nature of the pledge. What would the signatories of a North Atlantic Treaty pledge to do? Next slide, please. So as you all know, on April 4th, 1949, NATO was created to, as you already heard, the famous words by Lord Ismay, keep Russians out, Germans down, and the Americans in. Next slide, please. Just a few comments regarding this pledge, the famous Article 5. You can all read the article here. What I want to point out is that the pledge, the commitment was kept purposely vague. The Allies suggested in this article that in the event of an attack on a member, each member decides to take such action as it deems necessary. This wording came about due to the asymmetric threat perception. The US at the time was much less threatened by research in Germany and geographically further removed than, of course, the European countries were. So the Europeans wanted a greater pledge, but they couldn't get it because of this asymmetric threat perception. So this is all the Americans were willing to commit to in 1948 to leave themselves wiggle room to decide what they would actually do. Would they send military aid? Would they send troops? Would they simply provide equipment to the Europeans and so on? Now, returning once more to 1948, on June 1st, 1948, the Western Allies announced plans to establish a separate West German state. And of course, on October 7th, Stalin then announced the creation of an East German state. Now that several West European countries were cooperating economically and militarily, we also now see movement toward political and social integration. Next slide, please. Already on the 21st of October 1942, Winston Churchill, of course, had shared a vision of a Council of Europe. And so a few years later, in a speech on September 1946, Churchill also stressed the need for a partnership between France and Germany as a first step in the recreation of a European family. And then in May 48, a Congress of European Unity movement in The Hague proposed such a council, It was inaugurated a year later in Strasbourg in May 1949. And of course, the most important thing that came out of the Council of Europe was the European Convention on Human Rights, which was issued in November 1950. Now, these international events of 1948, 1949, like the Prague coup, the Berlin blockade, plans for NATO, made French politicians Robert Schuman and Georges Bidault realize that they would need to rethink the relationship. So on May 9th, 1950, the Schuman Declaration was presented by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. And this declaration then led to the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which came about in April 1951 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. The treaty was signed by France, Germany, and the Benelux. And this European Coal and Steel Community is so important because it was the first of the European communities which culminated ultimately in what we now know as the European Union. It was a supranational institution where member states curtailed their autonomy very significantly, where they delegated authority to this higher supranational institutional structure. It was of great importance in that it was to make war between France and Germany materially impossible, because the Schuman Plan called for the placement of French and German coal and steel production under one high authority. And coal and steel, as you all know, are the materials used in armament production. And so the Schuman Declaration was really important, not just in economic terms, but it had very significant security implications. It deserved its own slide, but since the treaty was not signed till 1951 and I was only supposed to talk till 1950, Vicky pointed out, luckily yesterday, that I ignored the Schuman Doctrine and I had to put it back in my notes, but couldn't add it to the slides. Now, moving right along, with the outbreak of the Korean War on June 25th, 1950, of course, the threat increased even further. There was the fear that Korea would be a dress rehearsal for Europe. And so it became clear that there was a need for more Western troops. The British, the French, the Benelux had basically anteed up. They had recovered fairly well from the war thanks to Marshall Aid, but they could not really ask their taxpayers for additional contributions. And so then the outbreak of the Korean War and the need for greater Western troops led, of course, to the question of German rearmament. Next slide, please. Jean Monnet and René Pleven, a French politician of the Fourth Republic, proposed a European army. Now think about this. Germany had attacked France numerous times throughout history, and the French were not at all thrilled about the prospects of a rearmed neighbor. So the goal then, to come up with a European army, of course, was to avoid an independent German army. Instead, German troops would be integrated into units from other countries. And not surprisingly, this was extremely controversial. The US thought it would take too long to bring this European army about. The German Social Democrats were pacifists and opposed German rearmament. Chancellor Adenauer, a Christian Democrat, managed to persuade Germany to go along with plans for a European defense community, another word for this European army, even though 70% of the population were opposed to rearmament. He said Germany needed to rearm to regain trust and equality while signaling institutional restraint to the Allies. This was not a foregone conclusion. Had Adenauer's opponent, the leader of the opposition party, the Social Democrats, a person by the name of Kurt Schumacher, if he had won the German elections in 1949, he would have been much more likely to insist on equal rights for Germany and would have opposed the European army. I've written about these folks in Cultures of Order. I hardly ever advertise my own books, but if anybody has a particular interest in Germany and how politicians really made a big difference despite the constraints of the international system from the end of World War II to the end of the Cold War, you can look here. Slide 20, next slide, please. And I'm almost done. So then the European Defense Community Treaty was signed in 1952, but in 1953, with the death of Stalin and a truce in Korea, the French Parliament now fails to ratify the treaty. Even so, the French proposed the creation of this European army to prevent an independent German army. The Assemblée Nationale fails to ratify the treaty, and this European army basically is dead. Ultimately, however, German rearmament did take place. The British now made concessions to keep their troops on the continent. An agreement was reached to enlarge the Brussels Treaty Group and allow West Germany and Italy to join. This organization then became known as the Western European Union. And just to finish the story of German rearmament, in 1955, West Germany then joined NATO. Last slide, please. So to conclude, the West sought to transcend this utter destruction, misery, and hopelessness that my colleagues described so well via political and economic restructuring and institution building. And once the threat was no longer perceived to be solely political in nature, when it was more than just the fear of communist infiltration, as one would expect, we then see the creation of military alliance. States are very protective of their autonomy, of their freedom of action. They don't part with this easily. They only do that when they need to do this. Now, meanwhile, in the East, Stalin curtailed freedom of the satellite states. We see communist seizures of power, and the state began to exercise monopoly over economic decisions. In January 1949, we see the creation of the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, COMECON, which made clear that each country had to trade bilaterally with the USSR. And finally, in May 1955, the Soviets create the Warsaw Pact to counter NATO. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, Katja. Thank you very, very much. We had 4 really incredibly rich presentations that set out clearly the lingering effects of the Second World War on societies, including in terms of enduring hostilities, and how those impacts shaped the post-war political landscape. And they also identified competing visions within and between countries about how to best deal with the twin challenges of Germany and the Soviet Union. And the ensuing choices about how to deal with those problems contributed to the Cold War and the creation of multilateral institutions that structure international relations to this day. Presentations also underlined the centrality of U.S. leadership in both promoting post-war reconstruction in Europe and in constructing the multilateral institutional architecture. There's a lot of information there, so I will turn it over to you for your questions.
Okay, so we'll start with Bill Hoffman, who asks, to no one in particular, but the entire panel, why didn't FDR keep Truman informed so he could step in to the post-war negotiations if FDR was disabled or died? This seems to be horribly negligent of FDR, especially when his health was failing. The same admission regarding the atomic bomb.
I think we're
Okay.
slightly handicapped here, and we have primarily Europeanists rather than that's a question aimed at an American historian.
Indeed. So we'll move on then. We'll move on to Robert Thornton, who asks, was there any serious consideration of military action against the Soviets by the Allies at the end of the war, apart from Patton's reported bluster?
I think that's a question for Phil.
He alluded to something. So.
I think we were supposed to have somebody filling in for Phil from yesterday. So possibly if we can bring those folks back in, possibly they can answer these military questions.
I do have Woody.
I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but since these are experts better equipped in this area, just in case you want to chime in.
Appears that Woody is having some technical issues.
I don't have an answer, so I don't want to come up on it.
Okay.
I mean, my guess for the second one, at least, is that Stalin certainly was concerned about that and wanted to consolidate power in Eastern Europe as quickly as possible in case the Allies were planning something. But I don't know about the Allied side of it.
Looks as though Sai is trying to join us as well and also having trouble.
Possibly that's why the audience is quiet. Maybe they cannot connect to this.
Let's just give a couple of...
This is, sorry, Alistair, sorry to interrupt. There is a new one. This is from Joel Greenstein. Could you talk a bit more about the treatment of women in the Allied countries after the war, building on the discussion of women who consorted with the opposition?
May I take that? Is my mic on?
Yes.
Yes?
Okay. Well, I mean, what I introduced with the slide about the women who were publicly humiliated out of suspicion of their keeping company with the Germans. I'll use Gertrude Stein's formulation. It's important to remember that, at least in France, women did not even have the right to vote until after the war. So it was 1944 when French women earned the right to vote, even though many French women were quite brave and fought in the resistance alongside men. So that's one thing that I would say was important. Women had gained the suffrage in many other Western European countries earlier than France. But I would just say that was that was a continuing struggle for women to, enter political life. Maybe I'll stop there. Claire, I don't know if you or Katya want to add anything.
As far as Germany goes, since this was specifically about the Allied countries, so not Eastern Europe, with Germany, in West Germany, it was, like you said, Vicky, earlier, the men in were killed in the war. So it was a female-run society for a while as they waited for the survivors to come home, and for the children who survived to grow up. So there was a lot of female agency at this point in some ways, and the women were the ones who were responsible for rebuilding Germany. So you may have seen those famous images of women who were going through rubble, sorting out usable bricks from unusable bricks, and then literally rebuilding the country. So I think the story of the women at this time period, certainly with the use of rape against them as, wartime and post-war method of control, and then also the tremendous amount that they did to actually rebuild the country is really an undertold story, but certainly an interesting one.
Yeah, I can add to that as well. I mean, I see it again through the lenses of my parents and grandparents. I mean, women had a really tough role during the war and very much after the war. So much was destroyed. There was hunger. People were freezing. The women had to take care of their children. They also had to figure out how to rebuild the houses, how to move from the countryside where many had fled in the hope of countering starvation, because life in the countryside was always a little bit easier than cities. Had to figure out how to return. They were psychologically had all kinds of issues, still nightmares from being in shelters and fearing the bombs, and just trying to keep the family going till their husbands could return, unless they already knew that they would never return, waiting for people to come back from POW camps. Those were really difficult times, but I think the women did a remarkable job, and quite frankly, so did the children. Right? I mean, the boys had to be the heads of the family at age 10, 12, and it's difficult. Right? So, yeah, it took several years for the situation to improve, and I think those are memories that people, regardless on which side, are unlikely to forget.
So this next question comes from Mark, and he asks, how long did it take for a legitimate national government to be organized in Germany, and how was this accomplished?
Well, I would say a legitimate government came about in 1949 when Adenauer was elected chancellor. He, as I already indicated, of course, Germany was under occupation status, and that wasn't really, Germany didn't fully regain its sovereignty until German unification on October 3rd, 1990. But there was a legitimate German government starting with 49. Chancellor Adenauer pursued policies that the occupation powers, the three Western occupation powers, could stand behind. He showed that he was interested in regaining the trust of the international community, in fair and open elections, in curtailing Germany's freedom by bringing it into these institutions that I already mentioned, rather than to insist on equal rights for Germany as his opponent would have done. That would have not gone over well. Poland, as much as France, were, of course, terribly afraid of a resurgence in Germany as immediate neighbors, and wanted to be sure that if Germany were to regain power and not be so sent back by destroying all its industry, as Henry Morgenthau had proposed, then a revival of Germany could only be palatable in a European context. And the French understood it, the Germans understood it really well, but there were people within Germany also who felt not everybody was a Nazi. And Kurt Schumacher, for instance, that in a concentration-like situation when he left the country, when the Nazis took power, and he returned after the war, emaciated. He had lost a limb in World War I, and he felt he didn't have to hide. He did nothing wrong, and there were a lot of other people, many on the Social Democratic side, who felt that Germany had paid, and that a very punitive treaty, of course, would not be in anybody's interest. And so they would have pursued very different policies. So in many ways, it was good that an institutionalist assumed power rather than somebody who would have insisted on equality at the early stages of the end of World War II.
I can just add on to that, Katja. At the subnational level, even prior to 1949, in the occupation zones, the military was encouraging Germans to form their own political bodies. So Katja's, given you the comprehensive overview of what's happening at the national level starting in 1949, and they did sort of the prep work for self-governance, democratic self-governance in the Western zone. Starting at the end of the war, when the Allies, and especially the US, because they had more resources than the UK and certainly France, which had to fight on its own territory. The US was really instrumental in the US military in setting up, local parliaments, city councils, mayors, those type of things, where Germans were making their own political decisions and governing areas in the occupation zones, but with the understanding that the Americans had the ultimate say, or the occupying force had the ultimate say, whichever zone they were in. So there was oversight of the law making that the Germans were doing, and it was made very clear to the Germans that certain types of laws would be permissible and others would not be. And so there was basically practicing democracy for several years before the legitimate West German government took over then fully in 49.
Yeah.
Sorry about the delay there. So this next question comes from Michael Mother, who asks, were the financial resources of the Marshall Plan distributed proportionally to losses incurred in Western European countries?
I don't think so. Correct me if I'm wrong, Katja and Vicky.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I think it was done strategically. So who's politically most important and geopolitically most important? So West Germany got a ton of money because that was the buffer against communism. I don't know if you two have anything to add.
I don't know any specific stats on that either, but since each country had to submit a plan, what this recovery would look like and what the money was needed for, I also don't think that it was, not every country got the same aid. It was a strategic decision on the part of the US. But I don't know numbers. Vicky, do you?
I don't, but I can direct you to the brilliant book that I had on a slide by Ben Stile, who published the book on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. I do not recall, I read the book, but I don't recall. That's a good question. I can also direct you to the German Marshall Foundation. There's a wealth of resource, but I don't have the answer to that. I know, Katja, you may be able to help me out with this. I know there was Jean Monnet had been appointed by Charles de Gaulle to head up the modernization plan, the economic reconstruction of France. And I know that at some point, Desmond Dinan talks a bit about this, so Alistair, you may recall as well. There was some conflict really between all of the national plans, but especially in France, the national economic, their own plans for economic recovery. And in France, you know, the idea was really to resort to dirigisme and using the state resources and not worrying so much about incurring debt. But that was slightly, it was not exactly in alignment with the American vision for, responsible spending and rebuilding. So it's an important question, but I can't answer you. I can just direct you to that really interesting book. There were actually several books written on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the Marshall Plan. But thank you for the question. Sorry for the inadequate answer.
Yeah, I mean, the goal from the German perspective was to build a social welfare state, right? To tax the population pretty heavily and to make up for all the things that the population had to do without, to help really rebuild the country on solid ground. And so I think a lot of the Marshall Aid, I mean, obviously to rebuild the industry, but actually German industry was not destroyed as terribly as many people think, 50%, but it's still, some centers were hit really hard, like obviously Dresden, we talked about Ludwigshafen with the BASF, and, strategic areas like that. But so a lot went into social welfare programs also.
This one comes from Bill Gibson, and he has more of a statement rather than a question. He says he's surprised that the reunified German government allowed the U.S. to remain after 1990. Does this surprise you as well? And this is directed towards you, Dr. Weber.
To remain, do you mean the military, the U.S. troops would remain in Germany, or not really sure? Because of course the Germans, the vast majority of Germans want the Americans to stay as long as they possibly would, and the recent troop withdrawal of 12,000 soldiers from German soil and redeployment to Poland is not something the majority of Germans saw favorably. So in many parts of Germany, at the end of the war, people prayed that the Americans would come and not the Russians, Soviets, because people knew that the Soviets, having lost over 20 million of their own citizens, were out to revenge. And that explains what Vicky said, the mass rape and very brutal treatment. In the area where my family is from, we were lucky that the Americans came, and the relationship between Germans and Americans was really good. I mean, the Americans, for the most part, were very friendly toward the population, and this relationship, having soldiers stationed in Germany for so many decades, it's a very close bond between the two countries. And so we would love for Americans to stay indefinitely. So I don't know whether that's what you had in mind, soldiers, because politically, of course, Germany has fully regained its sovereignty with the 2+4.
So this next question is an anonymous question, but it's directed towards Dr. Greenstein and Dr. Birchfield. And they ask, you both talk about the difficulty in turning off the gruesome switch that was turned on during both world wars. How were European leaders able to do this in an effort to rebuild Europe if their citizenry were still operating with their switches turned on?
Vicki, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, on the one hand, it was just we have to get on with it. There were political leaders who returned. I mean, some political leaders in France and Belgium, the Netherlands, remained and fought in the resistance. Others were in exile. Certainly, figures like de Gaulle led a government in exile. So when they returned, I mean, the idea was to try to reinstitute democratic institutions that had been suspended, in a sense, during the German occupation. And I'm not exactly sure what you mean by, switching off. I mean, I think there was a, great enthusiasm for West Europeans to rebuild their countries, to regain, their democratic life. And in fact, this would transfer also to the spirit Katya touched on, and it was on one of my slides that I was unable to cover, that there was a great feeling that the most important commitment was to human rights, justice, and democratic government. And this would manifest not only in active engagement politically and rebuilding their political institutions, but also in the pan-European movement, that this would be an unequivocal commitment. And that one of the Congress of Europe that Katya mentioned, there were over 1,000 people who attended that. So I think that turning the switch on was just the willingness to rebuild. But there was this period where, which way they would go, what was up for grabs, even in France and Italy, where the Communist Party was so strong. I guess that's what I would leave it there. Claire?
As far as Eastern Europe goes, I think you could make an argument that they never turned the switch off. If you look at the communist regimes, those were brutal dictatorships where it was completely normalized for citizens to be spied upon the entire time. East Germany, with their secret police, actually there was a higher percentage of secret police employees and informants per capita than anywhere else in the world. And all across Eastern Europe, these communist regimes spied on their citizens. They would kidnap people off the streets. They sent teenagers into workhouses that were so traumatic that basically all you have to do is say the name and people know that you experienced extreme trauma in your childhood by living at this workhouse. In Eastern Europe, it was not switched off. You had the show trials happening in Czechoslovakia, and you had show trials, of course, in the Soviet Union, and the truth did not matter. It was just, were you on the right political side at the time to escape being imprisoned for decades, or murdered without your family knowing, or subjected to psychological torture? If you happen to be lucky enough to not say the wrong thing at the wrong time, not be reported upon by your children, not fall afoul of the regime in any one of millions of ways that you could, then you would get through it. But in Eastern Europe, the switch was not turned off. And that's part of why it was so difficult for these countries to democratize in the 1990s, is they had experienced brutality after brutality, and that was the normal state of affairs for them.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, unless you answer this one, in which case we don't.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, Chris, do you want to go?
Yeah, we do have one last question, and this comes from Hannah Kitzmiller, who asks, if a mistrust between the USSR and the U.S. existed by the time of the Yalta Conference, why were Soviet concessions believed in with little to no repercussions outlined for not following through, which inevitably happened?
So my perspective on this is that essentially the US and the UK, the Allies were tired of fighting. They were tired of war. They just didn't want to deal with it anymore. And they didn't trust Stalin, but they also didn't realize to what extent they couldn't trust Stalin. So, he was Uncle Joseph. And he really, if you look at polls immediately after World War II, and you ask people in Western Europe who won the war, they would answer the Soviet Union. So even Westerners were extremely grateful to the Soviets and did not want to be suspicious. And as far as leadership goes, they didn't really they were so focused on winning the war. And the US wasn't just focused on the European side of things, they also had the Pacific theater to think about. And so there were so many moving parts that it kind of got lost in the shuffle, and people really didn't realize how far Stalin was going to push. And he didn't realize either. He figured, well, I'll push to see how much they'll let me take. You know, it's like a little kid who keeps sneaking things out of the cookie jar until the mom realizes, oh, wait, there's cookies missing. And then says, all right, hard stop here. And for the Allies, that hard stop was, you know, the Berlin airlift and the Berlin Wall and things like that, where we said, okay, enough is enough. You can't push any farther.
Yeah, maybe I just want to add a sentence to that. There is definitely something to what Claire said, but I think to some extent, the Western powers